The night folds slowly around Montgomery and the streetlights glow like tired eyes that have stayed awake for too many years watching injustice carve deep scars into the faces of people who have learned to walk with pain like a second skin, and the air is heavy with quiet sorrow and unspoken anger and hope buried deep inside hearts that beat with stubborn strength, and the wind carries the soft echo of footsteps moving through the cold, and those footsteps belong to a woman who for too long has been told to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay invisible. Her name is Rosa, and as she walks the worn path home after another long day at work, her muscles ache and her breath trembles with exhaustion, but something inside her feels different tonight, something restless, something rising, something that refuses to shrink anymore, and she can hear the whisper of memories pressing against the edges of her thoughts, memories of children forced to learn the language of fear before the language of dreams, memories of doors slammed shut, of voices silenced, of bodies bruised by hands that never learned mercy, and she feels those memories coil around her ribs like vines, tightening until she cannot breathe without tasting the bitterness of years stolen. The moon watches from above, pale and distant, as if afraid to look directly at the truth unfolding below, and the stars blink like witnesses who have seen too much suffering and stayed silent too long, and Rosa steps forward with the steady rhythm of someone who has endured the weight of injustice until endurance itself becomes an act of rebellion, and with every step she carries the strength of ancestors whose names history tried to bury but whose spirits refuse to die, and she carries the dreams of children not yet born who will one day walk streets that do not bleed beneath their feet. Her journey stands woven into the fabric of the nation, a thread that will never fray, and her story shines like a beacon guiding humanity toward a future still being built, and those who walk that path walk with her spirit beside them, steady and unwavering, and they know that they carry her dream now, that they are responsible for nurturing its growth and protecting its truth. And somewhere in the quiet places where history rests and memory breathes softly, the image of a woman seated on a bus at the end of a long day remains etched into the heart of time, her back straight, her gaze calm, her soul unshaken, and the world pauses before her image and whispers the truth shaped by her life. Courage does not shout. Courage sits still. Courage says no when the world commands yes. And the world rises because she refused to move. And the world walks because she remained seated. And the world breathes freer because she stood for justice by sitting down. For Rosa Parks sat down so that humanity could rise. And humanity continues to rise still. And will always rise as long as her story lives. And her story will live forever, carried in the heartbeat of every fight for freedom, every march for equality, every voice raised against injustice, every child who learns the meaning of dignity, every soul that chooses to stand unbroken. The seat she refused to surrender became the ground where generations stand. The moment she held her place became the turning point of history. The word she spoke continues to echo in the soul of the world. No. And when anniversaries pass and candles are lit in remembrance of the day she refused to rise from her seat, and bells ring across churches and schools and civic halls, people bow their heads not in grief but in gratitude, grateful for the strength she carried, grateful for the hope she ignited, grateful for the world she changed, and they speak softly the words that shaped the future and gave birth to a revolution, peaceful, powerful, and unstoppable. No. And those two letters echo across time, resonating like thunder through history, reminding the world that change does not require armies or weapons or violence, but the courage of a single voice refusing to accept the unacceptable, refusing to obey injustice, refusing to surrender its humanity, and in that echo millions find their own strength, rising like dawn after endless night. The world continues to teach her story because it is a reminder that history is shaped not only by leaders whose names rise in headlines but by ordinary people making extraordinary choices, and Rosa Parks remains a testament to the power of conscience and the strength of conviction and the transformative force of peace, and her life stands as proof that dignity once claimed cannot be taken and justice once awakened cannot be silenced. And today her name is spoken in places she never saw, by people she never met, by children born long after she left the earth, and each time it is spoken it carries with it the weight of her courage and the light of her soul, and the promise that freedom continues to grow from the seeds she planted that day when she remained seated. Leading from the darkness of prejudice to the light of equality and freedom, and no matter how many years pass her story remains bright, unclouded, and unbroken. Across nations, activists speak of her when teaching others to resist oppression, and they recall the lessons learned from her life, that patience and persistence hold greater power than force, that truth cannot be suffocated forever, that the dignity of one can ignite the liberation of millions, and they carry her example as a compass guiding their steps through battles still being fought. For the work is not finished and the struggle continues as new generations stand against new forms of injustice and new systems of oppression rise and challenge the progress won through sacrifice and perseverance, and each time the world trembles on the edge of despair, her name returns like a steady drum, a reminder that resistance is always possible and that every wave of change begins with a single act of refusal to accept what is wrong. And in moments when hearts break under the weight of hatred and when voices tremble with exhaustion and fear, the image of Rosa Parks sitting steadfast upon that bus becomes a lantern glowing through darkness, and her presence returns like the warmth of dawn to remind the world that endurance is stronger than cruelty and unity stronger than division and love stronger than hate. Young people gather in circles reading her words and learning the history she helped shape, and they speak of her not as a distant icon but as a guide whose footsteps they follow, and they promise one another that they will not allow her struggle to fade into memory, and they vow to continue the journey she helped begin, building bridges where walls once stood, lifting those cast down by injustice and standing firm whenever the world demands they bow. The years continue forward and the story of Rosa Parks weaves itself into the soul of the nation, and scholars, activists, teachers and children speak her name with reverence and gratitude, and her memory lives not as an artifact of the past but as a living force shaping action and inspiring courage, and her story becomes a pillar in the foundation of human rights around the world, and her refusal becomes an anthem sung quietly across generations who draw strength from her steady resolve in the face of injustice. In classrooms across the country, students open textbooks and find her photograph, a quiet woman sitting in dignity, her gaze steady, her hands folded, and they read the words that describe her life, and they learn that courage can be quiet and change can begin in a single moment, and they listen to recordings of those who knew her speaking softly about the depth of her character, about her calm, about her strength, and they begin to understand that greatness is not measured by volume or force but by integrity and the refusal to surrender dignity. Museums open their doors to tell her story, displaying the bus where she refused to stand, preserving the seat that became the center of a movement, and visitors walk through the halls silent and reverent, touching the cold metal railing, feeling the tangible echo of history carved into the floor beneath their feet, and they imagine the weight of the moment when silence broke and the course of the future turned, and they stand in reflection, humbled by the magnitude of a single stand taken without raising a voice. Artists paint her portrait, poets write her name in verses that carry the sound of hope, musicians compose songs that rise in tribute to her legacy, and filmmakers craft stories drawn from the truth of her quiet defiance, and in each creation the world is reminded that her life became a bridge. The funeral services gather leaders from across communities and faiths and politics and generations, and they speak of her courage, her dignity, her humility, and her extraordinary impact, and choirs sing songs of hope and freedom, and the sound rises through the air carrying the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow, and when she is laid to rest the world weeps, not only for loss but in gratitude for a life that changed the course of humanity. Monuments are built, schools named, highways renamed, statues raised, libraries dedicated, and history books written telling her story not only to the generation that lived through it but to every generation that will come after, and her face becomes a symbol standing among the great figures of justice, and her name becomes a lesson spoken in classrooms around the world, and her story becomes a reminder that a single act of courage can alter the path of history. Her legacy continues to move through time, carried by those who study her actions, who march in her footsteps, who fight for fairness in new battles still unfolding, and the world continues to struggle with injustice and discrimination, but her example remains a lighthouse guiding the work of those who refuse to give in, and her memory stands unshaken through decades, reminding all people everywhere that change is possible no matter how great the resistance, no matter how long the fight, no matter how heavy the burden. And every December 1st each year people gather in remembrance of the day she refused to stand, and they sit in silence reenacting the moment that began a revolution, and across cities people ride buses in her honor, sitting where they choose without fear, without shame, without being told to move, and they remember that a single voice can rise against a broken system and change the course of the world. She helps establish the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development to guide young people to become leaders and to teach them the history of the struggle for equality, and she supports the Pathways to Freedom program, helping students learn the history of the Underground Railroad and the fight for freedom, and she believes deeply that young people must know the past so that they can shape the future with clarity and purpose, and she continues to travel, speak and teach for many more years, giving everything she has to the work of justice. Time moves forward and Rosa grows older, and her hair turns silver and her steps slow, and she becomes a figure admired around the world, recognized wherever she goes, a living symbol of peaceful resistance and the power of integrity, and she continues to attend events and speak with students and leaders and activists until her strength begins to fade and she withdraws from public appearances, resting quietly in her home with loved ones and supporters near her, and the nation continues to honor her. legacy while she watches from peaceful silence. When her passing comes in 2005, the world pauses and remembers the woman whose simple refusal ignited a movement that changed everything, and her body lies in honor in the rotunda of the United States Capitol, a rare tribute given only to the most influential figures in the nation, and thousands stand in long lines stretching through the night waiting to pay respects to the woman who sat down so that millions could stand, and people from across the world travel to honor her memory, bowing heads, whispering prayers, laying flowers, and thanking her for the strength she carried without raising her voice. Dignity. Rosa continues to speak at universities, centers of culture, meetings, and commemorations, and her voice reaches new generations who study the movement not as distant history but as a living struggle whose consequences still shape their lives. And she speaks not in grand rhetoric but in steady truth, and young people listen, leaning forward, not wanting to miss a single word, and they ask her questions about courage and sacrifice, and she answers simply that she wanted to be treated equally and fairly, and that she believed in standing up for what was right. Awards and honors arrive, and she receives them with humility and grace, accepting recognition not for herself but for the movement and for the countless unnamed people who fought beside her and before her. And she never lets the world forget that she was part of something far larger than any single person, and that the movement was built by thousands whose names were never written into books but whose contributions are carved into the stones of history. She receives the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest awards in the United States, recognizing her extraordinary role in advancing human rights, and she receives the Congressional Gold Medal from lawmakers who stand to honor her, and the audience rises to its feet, applauding long and loud, and Rosa stands quietly, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, and her expression calm and steady, and photographs capture her standing among leaders of government who speak with deep respect for the woman who changed the course of the nation with her quiet refusal to move. They eventually moved to Detroit, seeking steadier ground and economic safety, and there Rosa continues her work, volunteering and supporting organizations fighting for civil rights, voting rights, equality, employment, and education. And she works for Congressman John Conyers, helping people who come into the office looking for assistance and support, and she remains dedicated to serving the public and uplifting her community without seeking praise or recognition. Years pass and the nation continues to transform, shaped by lawsuits and marches and speeches and sacrifices, and Rosa remains an enduring presence in the movement, attending events, speaking at gatherings, standing with leaders younger and older, and she watches the civil rights movement grow into an unstoppable force led by voices across the nation demanding fairness in education and employment and housing and in the voting booth, and she witnesses new laws passed that strike down barriers which had stood for generations. She attends the March on Washington in 1963, where hundreds of thousands gather in the largest demonstration for rights the country has ever seen, and she stands among the crowd listening to the speeches, including the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who speaks of dreams rising from despair and of freedom ringing across the nation. And she remains quiet among thousands, but her presence is felt like a steady heartbeat in the body of the movement, and those who know her understand the powerful thread she represents, woven through everything that has come to be. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 follows, and Rosa witnesses laws change that had once seemed immovable, and she sees the shift that began with one act on one bus spread through every corner of the nation. And though discrimination does not disappear, and though hatred continues to rise and fight back, the foundation has changed, and forever the world will remember that resistance can begin with a single refusal to surrender. The legal fight continues through months of testimony and appeals and arguments, and crowds gather outside the courthouse each time, hoping that the law will at last recognize their humanity, and judges sit high above them, reading pages of evidence and statements, each word heavy with the weight of an entire people demanding justice. And at last the ruling comes, declaring that segregation on public buses is unconstitutional and illegal, and the victory sends waves of celebration across Montgomery and far beyond, and Rosa becomes a face recognized around the world, a symbol of peaceful resistance and moral strength. The Montgomery bus boycott ends, and people return to buses not in surrender but in triumph, and they board with heads held high, no longer required to move, no longer required to shrink, no longer forced to accept humiliation as an everyday rule. And these moments unfold quietly with little fanfare, but they mark the beginning of a transformation still unfolding across the nation, and Rosa stands among them, watching children climb into seats without hesitation, watching elders rest without being forced to stand, and she knows that something has changed forever. Yet the path ahead remains steep and dangerous, and the victories come at great cost, and Rosa and her husband Raymond face consequences for standing in the light of national attention, and their safety is threatened, and they lose their jobs and face constant harassment, and they receive phone calls filled with hate and threats intended to silence them. But they do not turn away, and they do not step back. They continue to speak, they continue to work, they continue to carry the movement forward. The movement continues to build across the nation, and newspapers carry the story of Rosa Parks far beyond Montgomery and far beyond Alabama, flying across states and oceans, carried by headlines that call her the mother of the civil rights movement, and photographs show her standing calm and steady, her hands folded, her expression quiet yet unshaken, and people who have never heard her name before now speak it with reverence, and her story becomes a symbol of resistance and dignity, spreading through communities that had long suffered in silence. Organizations gather strength and groups form to challenge injustice in courts and on streets, and churches become centers of planning and meeting places where voices join together in prayer and determination, and the movement begins to expand from buses to schools to workplaces, and marches grow larger, filling avenues with bodies moving as one, and Rosa watches as people come forward from every direction to join the fight, inspired not only by what she did but by what the movement is becoming, a force that cannot be pushed aside or ignored. She appears in courtrooms and auditoriums and interviews where she speaks plainly and clearly about what happened and why she refused to stand, and her voice remains measured and calm, without anger, without bitterness, without dramatic flair, and reporters write about her composure, impressed by her steady presence and her unwavering commitment to justice, and she explains again and again that she was not trying to begin a movement, she was only tired of giving in, and she believed that she had a right to remain seated where she was. And her legacy lives in the hearts of millions, beating like steady drums, calling forward the future that she believed in with every breath she ever took. For Rosa Parks sat down so that the world could stand. And the world stands still. And the world always will. And she knows that when she is gone, the story will continue, and the fight will continue, and the hope will continue, because the world has learned to stand, and once a people learn to stand, they cannot be made to kneel again. And she knows that the moment she said no was a beginning, not an end, and that beginnings never die, they echo, they ripples, they shape the future long after the breath that created them has faded. She opens her eyes and watches a boy running across the grass, his arms spread wide like wings and his voice rising in pure joy, untouched by fear, and she feels tears gather warm and full, and she lets them fall without shame, because they are tears of victory, tears of gratitude, tears born from the knowledge that her life mattered, that her courage carried weight, that her refusal changed the world. And the wind moves through the trees and through her hair, and she hears it whisper the word that started everything, spoken softly as if from another lifetime, carried on the breath of all who followed her path. No. And she smiles, because she knows that word still lives, still burns, still reshapes the world, and she knows that somewhere deep within the heart of humanity the fire will never die. She rises slowly, taking one careful step, then another, and the ground holds her steady, and she moves forward into the golden light, pressing her palm against the world as if blessing the land she helped transform, and she breathes deeply, letting the air fill her lungs with peace, with pride, with love. And the world watches her walk, and the world remembers, because the world was changed forever by the quiet strength of one woman who chose dignity over fear, and truth over silence, and hope over despair. And her story flows on and on like a river that cannot be contained, carrying every voice that has ever risen after hers, carrying every dream built upon her courage, carrying every step taken toward freedom, carved from the echo of her defiance. The night stretches long and heavy, and she feels the shadows gather around her like old friends, and she remembers the sound of the bus engine rumbling beneath her feet, and the cold bite of metal cuffs around her wrists, and the slow steady rise of a movement that grew like wildfire from the spark she struck, and she realizes that history is made not by giants but by ordinary hands rising in extraordinary moments, and she breathes deeply, letting the truth settle inside her like a stone carved with the words of generations. Morning returns with pale light brushing softly across her face, and she rises slowly, her bones stiff but her spirit steady, and she steps outside into air thick with warmth and the scent of blooming flowers, and she sees children running with bright ribbons dancing behind them, and their laughter lifts like wings carrying the weight of 1,000 prayers answered, and she smiles soft and wide and full of something like peace, because this is what she fought for, this is what she carried, this is the promise she preserved. And she walks through the park where families gather, where voices mingle like music, where people of every shade sit side by side without fear, without walls, without permission, and she feels the world breathe differently, and she knows that the earth beneath her feet has changed, and that though scars remain, though wounds still bleed, the healing has begun, and no force can turn back what has started. She sits on a bench watching the world move around her, and she folds her hands together, resting them gently in her lap, and her breath moves slow and even, and she feels the sun warming her face like a blessing laid gently across her skin, and she closes her eyes, letting the warmth sink deep into her memory, and she thinks of every soul who walked before her and every soul who will walk after, and she feels connected to them all like threads woven into a tapestry so vast it stretches beyond the edges of time. She stands at the memorial surrounded by thousands, and she listens to the sobs shaking bodies that once carried pride like armor, and she feels her knees weaken because this loss is too big, too cruel, too heavy for one soul to carry, and she wonders how a world that has come so far can still be torn apart so violently by hatred so ancient and so blind, and she whispers a prayer into the air, her voice trembling like a candle flame caught in storm wind, asking that the dream does not die with him, that the fire burning inside millions does not fade into ash. And she watches as people gather tighter, pressing shoulders together, forming a circle of strength unbreakable, and she sees tears turn to determination and mourning turn to resolve, and the spirit of the man who dreamed rises among them, shaping their grief into armor and sharpening their pain into purpose, and they lift his name into the air like a banner carried forward into battle. And Rosa feels her heart steady once more because she knows now that a dream like his cannot die, it lives inside every person who has tasted the sweetness of hope and the bitterness of loss. She sits by her window late into the night, staring into the darkness that holds the faint glow of streetlights flickering like candles lit for the dead, and she closes her eyes, feeling the silence settle heavy around her, and she thinks about the long road behind her and the long road still ahead, and she wonders if she will see the day when the world truly becomes free, when peace is not fought for but lived, and she feels the ache of longing press through her ribs, and she whispers into the stillness that she hopes children yet unborn will never have to carry the weight of the battle she has fought all her life. She tells them that she was tired, that she was worn down by years of being treated as less, and that when she said no, she said it not as a hero but as a woman who finally realized the power of her own worth. And she watches as the truth sinks into their hearts and changes something inside them like seeds planted deep into fertile soil waiting to rise, and she sees hope stretch across their faces like dawn breaking across a dark horizon, and she knows that the future standing before her will grow mighty and unstoppable. The years pass and the world continues to wrestle with itself, caught between progress and resistance, between awakening and blindness, and Rosa watches as leaders rise and fall, as battles are won and lost, as the movement surges forward and is beaten back and rises again stronger than before like a tide that refuses defeat, and she listens to speeches that shake the marrow of her bones and sees marches flood the streets like rivers of living fire, and she watches history unfold through tears and silence and clenched hands and whispered prayers. And then the news comes like a blow to the chest, sharp and merciless, and the voice that once thundered with dreams of mountains carved into altars of freedom is silenced by violence, and the world shatters under the weight of grief, and people fall to their knees weeping in the streets and screaming into the sky, and the sound of sorrow echoes through every church, every home, every heart, and Rosa feels the world tilt beneath her feet, and she presses her hand to her chest, as if trying to hold the pieces of her breaking heart together. Time moves softly like a river slipping through the fingers of memory, and Rosa walks slowly through the days that unfold before her like pages turning in a great unwritten book, each day filled with stories she never imagined she would live, and each night heavy with dreams shaped by sacrifice and by hope, and the world around her shifts like earth trembling beneath the weight of footsteps marching toward a future still uncertain but pulsing with the rhythm of change that will not be stopped, and she feels the pulse inside her own chest, slow and steady like the beating heart of a movement that has grown far beyond her beginnings. She walks through parks where families sit beneath wide branches and sunlight spills across blankets laid over grass, and she listens to the laughter of children rising like song into the open sky, not weighed down by the chains of yesterday, and the sound washes through her like a warm tide, and she knows that this laughter is something sacred, a blessing earned through the struggle that has carved deep valleys through the lives of those who came before her, and she feels a tremor of joy rising through her bones, a joy sharp with the memory of pain but beautiful in its strength. She visits schools where students sit wide-eyed and eager, hungry for truth and dreaming wild dreams that soar higher than fear could ever reach, and they look at her with reverence and awe, but she sees something else shining in their eyes, something bigger than admiration, something deeper than respect. She sees the spark of becoming the first breath of a generation unafraid, and she stands before them speaking softly, her voice carrying the weight of both sorrow and triumph, and she tells them that courage is not born from grand gestures or thunderous speeches, but from ordinary moments when ordinary people choose to refuse the chains that bind them. For Rosa Parks taught the world that a single moment, a single breath, a single word spoken with courage can turn the course of history, and she showed that strength does not always roar and change does not always scream. Sometimes it speaks softly, quietly, defiantly, with the power of a soul refusing to yield, and she proved that the bravest thing a human can do is simply refuse to move when the world demands surrender. And her legacy flows like a river through the heart of time, carving new paths, shaping new generations, whispering through the ears of every child who learns what it means to stand still, stand unbroken, stand in the unshakable truth that every life matters and every voice carries weight and every person holds the power to change the world. And though her body one day returns to the earth, her spirit remains like a beacon burning bright in the night, calling out to those still walking the long road toward justice, reminding them to hold steady, hold strong, hold faith, and never, never bow. And the world remembers the woman who sat so that all could stand, and the world rises because she refused to move. Time moves forward and Rosa grows older, her hair silvering like frost on winter branches, her body stiffening with age, but her spirit remains fierce and unyielding, and she watches with quiet pride as children who once trembled now stand tall, unafraid to speak, and she sees young leaders rise carrying torches lit from the flames she once sheltered in her heart, and she knows the fight is not over, but the world is no longer the same world she once walked in chains. And on a quiet evening she sits by her window watching the sky blaze orange and gold as the sun sinks into the horizon, and she feels peace settle into her bones, and she thinks back to the moment she said no, to the moment she chose dignity over fear, and she wonders how different life might have been if she had stood that day, and she knows that the weight of centuries might still crush her people if she had chosen silence instead of truth. She thinks of the countless souls who walked beside her, seen and unseen, heard and unheard, those whose names history lost but whose courage shaped every stone on the path she traveled, and she whispers thank you into the dimming light, knowing they carried her as she carried them, and she feels the breath of hope move through the room as though the universe itself is exhaling gratitude. And when she closes her eyes she sees children laughing freely under a sky unburdened by hate, and she knows that the road is long and winding and unfinished, but she also knows that she has walked her part and walked it well, and that her story will continue long after her footprints fade from the earth, and she rests her hands in her lap just as she did on that bus so many years ago, and she lets the silence hold her in its arms. And though victory feels near, it is not without cost, and the movement faces storms that tear through peace like tornadoes, ripping homes from their foundations, and hatred rises desperate and wild, lashing out trying to drown hope before it reaches full strength, and threats come like poison and violence erupts like fire, consuming innocent lives, and Rosa feels her heart break again and again as funerals stretch long across the calendar, as mothers bury sons, and fathers bury daughters, and churches burn in flames meant to smother courage, and the nights howl with grief so heavy it threatens to crush the ground beneath it. But even in the ash of devastation, even in blood spilled across streets, the movement does not die, it grows, because pain sharpens resolve and loss deepens unity, and the stories of those taken become fuel for the fire, and Rosa stands in the silence of mourning surrounded by faces contorted with sorrow, and she speaks softly, reminding them that the fight is not just for today, not just for the living, but for the memory of those who gave everything, and for the promise that no life will be sacrificed in vain. And she carries on, walking, marching, speaking, believing, never bending, never breaking, and with each year the world shifts more, the laws that once held people hostage begin to crumble, falling under the weight of truth that cannot be denied, and freedom expands like dawn, spreading light across the horizon, and though racism does not disappear, its power weakens and its grip loosens, and the world begins to breathe differently, as if the air itself has learned the shape of justice. And the world begins to shift beyond Montgomery, across states, across borders, carried by news and voices and resistance, and the fight grows louder and stronger, and marches form like rivers flooding through cities, filling streets with bodies locked arm in arm, demanding change, demanding humanity, demanding breath, and in each crowd Rosa feels the unstoppable pulse of history writing itself into the bones of the nation, and the sound of thousands chanting, as one rises like a tidal wave crashing through the stale air of oppression and shattering windows built to separate dignity from power. In Washington the sky hangs heavy with expectation as more than 200,000 gather beneath the shadow of the monument, towering above them like a guardian watching over the birth of transformation, and the air is thick with sweat and hope and trembling prayer, and the crowd moves like a single living organism, heart sinking, lungs breathing the same breath, and Rosa stands among them, quiet tears tracing lines down her cheeks as she listens to Martin speak words that shake the ground beneath her feet, words that carve themselves into the hearts of millions, words that will echo long after his voice grows silent. I have a dream, he says, and the world stills, the wind holds its breath, the earth listens, and Rosa closes her eyes, letting the vision wrap around her like a warm blanket woven from tomorrow, and she sees a world where skin is not a barrier, where children walk side by side without fear, where people greet one another as equals, where dignity is not a battle but a birthright, and she feels her chest tighten with the overwhelming ache of longing and the fierce joy of possibility, and when she opens her eyes she sees the faces around her shining with a light she has never seen before, a light born from collective awakening. And outside the night unfolds like velvet, stretching deep and endless, and within that darkness Rosa feels the presence of those who walked long before her, those who marched through forests hiding from chains, those who prayed in whispers beneath the lash of cruelty, those who sang songs of freedom with voices trembling but unbroken, and she feels them gather like stars, forming a constellation around her, guiding her path, marking her place in a sky full of fighting spirits, and she lifts her face to the air and breathes in the legacy living inside her bones. Days pass and the seasons turn one into another, and still the work continues, and Rosa travels from town to town, speaking in small rooms and large halls, standing before faces that shine with determination and fear and longing, all braided into one, and she tells her story quietly, simply, truthfully, and she watches as people rise taller when they listen, as though hearing the truth gives their hearts something to stand on, and she sees tears stream down cheeks, both young and old, and she feels the power of her story grow larger than herself, echoing through the hearts of those who hear it. She meets mothers who clutch photo frames of sons lost to violence, who speak through clenched teeth and trembling voices, saying enough, no more, and she meets children who ask questions with innocent confusion, wondering why the world has been built on divisions that make no sense, and she meets elders whose backs curve like branches of ancient trees, who nod slow and solemn, knowing that the seeds they planted long ago are finally beginning to bloom, and each encounter shapes her like sculptors' hands, smoothing stone into something lasting, something meant to endure beyond time. She walks through the neighborhood where children play in the dust, with laughter rising like singing bells, and she watches as they run without the heaviness she once carried in her chest, each moment of joy a quiet rebellion against the shadow of pain left behind by generations, and she sees their eyes bright and wide with dreams bigger than the horizon, and she feels hope unfold inside her like a flower opening its petals for the first time under the warmth of spring, and she thinks that maybe, just maybe, they will grow up in a world where they never have to learn how to carry fear like weight around their necks. The people gather once more in church halls and community rooms and homes lit by lanterns, and the scent of candles fills the air, and the hum of voices blends like a river flowing strong, and they talk of what comes next, of marches yet to walk and laws yet to break and wrongs yet to expose, and they speak Rosa's name with reverence and with gratitude and with a love that stretches across the room like the arms of family, and she sits quietly among them, feeling the warmth of community wrap around her shoulders like a shawl woven from the threads of unity and resilience. Martin stands at the pulpit once again, and his voice rolls like thunder, softened by compassion and sharpened by truth, and he speaks not only of justice but of love, the kind of love that pulls strangers together into something unbreakable, the kind of love that refuses to bow to hate, and the people listen with hearts split open, ready to be filled, and he reminds them that the road ahead will be long and steep and carved from sacrifice, but they are not alone, and their strength is multiplied by every step taken together. The world continues to shift beneath the steady pulse of the movement, and days stretch long into nights filled with voices rising together like a storm that will not be contained, and the streets of Montgomery become ground soaked with the footsteps of thousands who refuse to yield and refuse to forget the moment that changed everything, and the buses roll again, but now they carry the weight of a victory earned through blood and sweat and endless endurance, and the people look at one another with new eyes, seeing not just neighbors or strangers but warriors who walked through fire and survived. The quiet after the storm settles like soft dust falling through sunlight, and life begins again, but nothing feels the same, and there is a different kind of silence now, a silence that hums with possibility, a silence that tastes like air that has finally been cleared after years of choking, and Rosa stands at her doorway breathing slow and deep, and she feels the wind shift around her as if the earth itself leans close to listen to the story still unfolding, and she knows that this victory is not the end, it is only the beginning. For every step taken across cracked pavement, for every tear shed into the dirt, for every voice raised against the weight of oppression, there are still countless battles waiting to be fought and countless hearts waiting to be freed, and Rosa understands that change does not come in one great wave but in the steady rise of tide after tide washing against stone until the stone gives way and becomes sand, and her life has become part of the tide, now part of something larger than any single moment could ever hold. Rosa stands still as the news reaches her, and the air around her changes as if the world has exhaled all at once, and her vision blurs with tears not of grief but of relief and pride, and the overwhelming weight of knowing that one small word spoken by a woman exhausted from labor and from living under cruelty has shifted the axis of the world, and she closes her eyes and lets the moment wash through her like sunlight breaking through endless darkness. And when she steps onto a bus again, she walks with quiet, steady feet, and she sits not because she is permitted but because she is equal, and because the seat belongs to her as much as it belongs to anyone, and the bus moves forward and the city outside passes like a dream unfolding, and she feels the presence of every ancestor walking beside her and every child yet to come watching her, and she knows that nothing will ever be the same. The movement continues long after that day, continues through marches that shake the earth and speeches that open the sky and battles fought on streets and in courts and in hearts and souls, but this moment, this spark, this refusal, this quiet unbreakable no stands at the center of all that follows like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. And even as years pass and the world changes and new struggles rise and new battles begin, her story lives like flame, like breath, like blood, moving through the body of every person who believes that dignity is worth everything, and that silence is surrender, and that freedom is a birthright carved into the bones of every human being whose heart knows the taste of hope. For Rosa Parks sat down so the world could stand. And the world will forever rise because she refused to move. And Rosa's name becomes a beacon, a whispered prayer, a fierce battle cry, and her story crosses oceans and borders and languages and becomes a symbol not only for one people, one struggle, one nation, but for every human heart longing to break the chains that keep them from rising. And the world watches as a movement grows, unstoppable, unstoppable, like a storm that sweeps across the land, shaking every foundation and forcing every eye to see what they have tried to ignore. The courthouse becomes a battleground not of fists or fire but of truth, rising against the machinery of injustice, and lawyers stand with trembling hands as they speak for those whose voices have been silenced, and judges stare down at papers trembling with the weight of history pressed into their ink, and the courtroom air hangs heavy with breath held tight, waiting for a decision that could either cement suffering into stone or break the chains choking a nation. Outside, the crowd gathers, thousands standing shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped, eyes lifted, hearts pounding, and they wait through the long hours of silence, trusting that justice will finally hear them. And the cold wind bites their skin and the rain soaks their clothes, but no one leaves because they have waited their entire lives for this moment, and they will not let it slip away. And then the doors open and a voice carries through the crowd, a voice shaking and loud and filled with awe as the words spill into the air. And the Supreme Court has spoken, and segregation on buses is illegal, and the chains crumble and the walls crack, and the sky seems to roar with triumph as cheers break through the silence like a flood, and tears pour freely from eyes that have stared too long at the ground and now lift to the sky. And still Rosa sits quietly in her small home as letters pour in, as threats come like knives disguised as words, as hatred tries to claw at her peace and fear tries to break her resolve, but she remains steady, steady like a rock against waves that crash and crash but cannot move her. And she thinks of her childhood and the nights she lay awake listening to the stories of her grandparents, stories of strength wrapped in suffering, stories of survival that shaped her bones like steel. And she knows that she is not alone and never has been. Outside, the world watches, some with admiration, some with disbelief, some with venom burning hot in their veins, because power built on oppression shakes when the oppressed rise, and fear cracks the false foundation of superiority, and those who cling to hate tighten their grip around the fragile edges of their control. But the tide is shifting and no hand can hold back an ocean once it begins to rise. Months pass and legs grow tired and storms beat down on bodies worn thin, but still the people walk and walk and walk, and the sound of their perseverance begins to echo far beyond Montgomery, reaching cities where strangers whisper of their bravery, reaching ears that have long waited for the sound of hope stirring, reaching hearts that have grown numb under the weight of cruelty, and awakening something long buried and long needed. Children walk beside their parents, their small feet pounding pavement as they listen to stories of what it means to stand and what it means to be free, and they learn that freedom is not given, it is claimed, and it is fought for, and the price is high and the journey long, but worth every aching step and every tear shed and every sacrifice made, because freedom is the breath of those who refuse to die inside their silence. His name is Martin, and his eyes shine with a light fierce enough to cut through darkness, and he speaks of dignity and courage and the sacred right of every human to stand without bowing and to walk without chains and to breathe without asking permission, and every word he speaks feels like fire falling into dry grass, and the people rise shaking with hope and fear and determination, and decide that they will walk instead of ride, that they will step forward together, with feet blistering and bones aching but with spirits unbroken, because they know that history is shifting beneath their feet and they will not turn away. The sun rises over Montgomery with pale light that falls across the faces of men and women and children who begin their journey long before dawn, and the streets fill with footsteps that beat against the earth like war drums, steady and unyielding, and the buses sit nearly empty, their engines rumbling in frustration like wild animals trapped and helpless, while the people walk miles beneath the hot sun and through the pouring rain and across the frozen winter ground, and with every step they declare that they will no longer carry the weight of humiliation in silence. Shoes wear thin and soles tear apart and feet bleed, but they keep moving because they are not walking just for themselves, they are walking for every name carved in soil, every story erased, every cry unheard, and they walk for a future they have never seen but believe in with every heartbeat. And as the days stretch into weeks, the movement grows until the city trembles with the thunder of footsteps refusing to surrender, and even those who once doubted now feel themselves drawn into the tide of rising courage. The night trembles under the weight of change unfolding, and the sound of Rosa's footsteps pulled away by force echoes through the streets like a distant drum calling sleeping courage to wake. And somewhere a window opens and someone whispers her name, barely more than breath, but enough to carry through the dark, because names like hers do not fade, they grow, they rise, they become a storm that the sky cannot hold forever, and the people who have lived for generations in the shadow of silence feel something shifting deep beneath their ribs, something ancient, something powerful, something waiting for this moment. Word spreads faster than the wind and faster than fear, and voices gather like rising water, filling every crack and every narrow alleyway and every quiet home where families sit together wondering if their children will grow up chained by the same injustices they have endured, and mothers with tired hands and fathers with backs bent from labor and children whose eyes have seen more pain than childhood should ever know sit together in dim light and whisper of Rosa, who refused to rise, and in that refusal they feel a spark ignite inside them, burning through the fog of hopelessness. And somewhere in a small church where wooden pews hold the weight of prayers whispered through decades of suffering, a young preacher stands tall, his voice trembling not with fear but with conviction, and he speaks to the gathered crowd whose hearts beat like a single heartbeat, and he tells them that this moment is not just hers, not just for one person or one night or one city, but for every life that has ever been bent under the crushing hand of injustice, and every voice that has been forced to quiet, and every dream suffocated before it had the chance to breathe. As they drag her away, the city holds its breath, and the night deepens, and thousands of hearts begin to beat with the rhythm of awakening, and the fire that spark ignited begins to spread from house to house, from voice to voice, from soul to soul, until silence shatters under the weight of courage, and the story of Rosa Parks travels like lightning through the veins of the community, and the people rise, and they stand together, and they walk into the streets with steps that thunder against the pavement, echoing louder than any army marching to freedom. She does not move, and her hands rest still in her lap, and her fingers curl just slightly as though gripping the edge of a cliff she refuses to fall from, and the weight of every eye pressing onto her shoulders tries to crush her into obedience, but something inside her spine locks firm like iron, and she feels her heartbeat thundering not in fear but in awakening, and the silence swells through the bus thick enough to choke, and the driver repeats his command, louder, sharper, laced with anger and disbelief, and she hears the words, but they sound like echoes from a distance, because her mind is steady and clear, and she knows exactly what she will say. She lifts her head slowly and looks forward into the air, heavy with waiting, and she speaks not with rage, not with trembling, not with pride, but with a quiet that carries the strength of all the years she has survived, and she says the word that will break the world open. No. The sound floats into the air like a spark falling onto dry earth, and the fire begins instantly, though no flame is visible and no smoke rises yet, and the driver stares at her with eyes burning with fury and confusion, and he shouts again, but she does not move, and she does not bow, and she does not offer apology or fear, and the silence becomes thunder, and she feels her heart steady and strong as a mountain rooted in the earth. The bus doors swing open, and the police arrive with heavy boots and heavy hands and heavy hatred shaped into the sharp edges of authority, and they grip her arms and pull her from her seat, and metal cuffs lock around her wrists, cold and unyielding as the laws that forged them, and yet she does not shake, and she does not cry, and she does not look down, because she knows there is power in looking straight ahead into the eyes of the world that has tried to erase her, and the ground beneath her feet feels solid like the foundation of a future built from steel and hope. Ahead, the bus waits, humming low like a restless animal pacing inside its cage, and Rosa climbs the steps, her hand brushing the cold metal rail that feels like the bars of a prison that she has been locked inside her entire life, and she finds her seat in the section carved out by hatred, a section built to remind her and everyone like her that the world believes they are less worthy, less human, less deserving of dignity, and she sits down with a breath so soft that no one hears the storm gathering beneath it, and the bus begins to move, grinding along the road like a tired beast dragging the weight of history behind it. The lights inside flicker just enough to make the air feel thick with tension, and the silence grows sharper with every passing minute, and Rosa watches the world blur beyond the window, buildings sliding past like memories trying to escape, and she thinks of every day spent bending to the rules that suffocate her, of every time she swallowed her voice to survive, and she wonders how many pieces of her soul she has already lost, how many more she must sacrifice before she is allowed to exist the way every human should exist, free and whole and unafraid. The bus slows to a stop again, and bodies climb aboard, filling the space with the noise of shoes scuffing the floor, the scratch of coats, the breath of strangers moving too close, and she can feel the tension tighten like a rope around her throat as more people crowd in until the aisle holds no more room, and then the driver turns his head, his voice slicing through the air like a blade that has cut far too many times, demanding that she stand and give her seat away, because a white passenger must sit Because the rules say she must, because the world expects her to disappear like smoke fading into nothing.